Hello, I'm Dr. Brian McConnell, Professor of Art History and Classical Archaeology at Florida Atlantic University. Let me add a warm welcome to the show Al di là delle reti, Beyond the Nets, the art of Tom DeSalvo, which represents the synergistic efforts of Broward College and the DeSalvo family to return the spotlight to an artist who is significant not only to the South Florida cultural community, but also to his native Sicily. Congratulations go to Domenico and her colleagues at Broward College for the ways in which they have brought together an interesting selection of the artist's work in an interactive virtual environment that overcomes the challenges of the present pandemic. In my remarks here, I wish to offer some considerations and on the works that you will see in the show, and Tom DeSalvo's techniques and aesthetic approach that mark his transfiguration as an artist. The title of this presentation, Sagoma and Stencil, captures the essence of Tom DeSalvo's techniques as you see them in this show. Sagoma is the Italian word for outline. It doesn't literally mean silhouette, as an outline or form doesn't necessarily have a solid fill. His figures are not shadowy. They are outlines filled in with distinguishing features. Sagoma, in Italian, also refers to a character, which Tom really was to the people that knew him. The figures that we encounter in his paintings, even when we know them from famous works of art, are always characters in a kind of commedia dell'arte that was all his own. Stencil, stampino or matrice in Italian, is the tool that he used to make the poetic fabric of these paintings. I have one of his stencils as a background here. It is a step forward from the use of the ruler evident in his earlier works, but it is still a tool used to achieve an end. Tom once said to a younger artist who was in a moment of self-doubt about her own abilities, "Look, I use stencil, and if I can make art with this, you certainly can with the talent that you possess." I'm paraphrasing, but that was the kind of mentoring that Tom could muster when it was needed, and it says something about the nature and vision of his own work, which sprang from the very deep well of spirituality that everyone mentions when they speak of him. Stencil is in essence mechanical, but it still requires the spirit and the mind of an artist to use it creatively. Previously, I had the chance to read carefully the texts of the paintings that Tom called the Candy Skin Chronicles, which are now on display at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, and I could see how he modified and used stencil lettering to his own ends. His orthographic system, which elides certain letters until they blend into the non-lexical forms that, as he put it, sandwich them, is executed with a precision somewhere between poetry and copy editing, which Tom did for a while to make a living. You're looking here at his painting, "With Her Stripes We Are Healed," in the series The Candy Skin Chronicles. And if you look down below to the lower right, you can see how the word mirabile, from mirabile dictu, which is a Latin expression, has been elided to a much smaller form, which takes a little bit of time to decipher. Tom DeSalvo was a self-taught painter. Everyone knew that, and he did not hide it from anybody. He had a strong motivation to draw and paint. It wouldn't leave him alone. He had sufficient control over line, but many of his sketches were done primarily with common pens, which have their own characteristics and don't always display nuance. He never really developed skill in rendering these three dimensions on the canvas, and he used his compositions to remain somewhat static, despite the use of the golden mean, which he called the golden spiral, but which others, like South Florida landscape painter A.E. Backus, called dynamic symmetry. Tom permitted himself to dabble in styles and techniques. We see only a few of them here. At times, you think he wanted to be Picasso, who was the greatest borrower of techniques and styles of all time. In much of the art of the 20th century, the visual elements and principles of design become protagonists on their own, as one may see in pop art, which Tom also emulated, often as a critique. To some extent, Tom DeSalvo was a minimalist in the way that he entrusted shape and line to Sagoma and Stencil, while at the same time maintaining the essence of form and the message that were all his own. The elements of his compositions are more iconic, that is, symbolic, than trompe-l'oeil, or credible enough to trick the eye. He is a minimalist in this sense because what you see is what you see, an expression coined by another Italian-American artist, Frank Stella. Tom explains his modus operandi in his notes that are called The Animal Black and White. You see his own writing here on the screen. To paint is to give concrete representation to light, light directly experienced only in the inner mind. The light is in the form of a vision which is straining to see herself, to deliver herself through the artist. The true artistic vision, like any other organic entity, labors to be born, the artist serving as midwife. The true artistic vision is a warring whole, integrated, made up only of parts which, outside the nexus of their mutual relationships, would exist only as jarring notes, mere appendages to a symphony. And it's interesting here to note the reference to sound. Tom was a contemporary painter also in the oral dimension of his work. The constant quotation and punning, or the melding of words and phrases worthy of a rapper, is oral poetry. It's not enough to see his paintings, you have to read them out loud. Let's look at some examples of Tom DeSalvo's work to get a sense for its oral dimension. We're looking here at his painting, His Clemency, which is number 2 in the series, The Candy Skin Chronicles. The text reads, His clemency hissed hot breath on his cold, greenstone enameled fingers, reached for his characteristic megaphone, end begun. Is this the face that lunched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless bras of Ille illa illum? To be continued. We note here the sibilants, the S sound, the words that run together, the respelling and the puns. The imagery combines, of course, a famous painting by the Greco-Spanish painter El Greco and an image of Ilona Staller, or Cicciolina, who was a famous porn star of the 1980s in Italy. She was, for a while, even a member of parliament. Here we see Tom DeSalvo's painting Anger, which is number 5 in the series, The Candy Skin Chronicles. The text reads, irate, didactive, pentaphonous quintets of quivering quibellaros dart at her second veil, with dancing and pranskin liboleros glissando. The painting includes readable musical notation for the main theme from Maurice Ravel's Bolero, and the images of Saint Sebastian and Salvador Dali are very easy to recognize. Here we see DeSalvo's St. John's Violin. The text reads, when nature underneath a heap of jarring atoms lay and could not heave her head, the tuneful voice was heard on high, arise, ye more than dead. The painting references Raffaello Sanzio's famous Transfiguration, which the artist liked so much that he willed that it be placed over his tomb in the Pantheon in Rome. Here, the musical metaphor is carried forward so much that Christ is represented by a violin. Tom was a man of many interests, ranging from philosophy to religion to poetry and to visual art. Today, we often substitute the word maker for artist, and that is actually an appropriate term here because it neutralizes the expectation of a professionalized focus on a skill in particular medium, and it opens the realm of artistry to a greater range of components. Tom composed his images almost as a remix, which is a contemporary way of drawing on the artistic heritage of the past. References to the histories of visual art and literature tie Tom DeSalvo's paintings to deeper traditions in a way that manifests the English poet T.S. Eliot's theory of tradition and the individual talent. Eliot explains that a tradition is formed of works, literary or visual, it doesn't really matter, that share basic elements and themes, which together constitute a whole work. When a new work is created with these same elements and themes, we say that it is in the tradition, but by its very existence, the new work has modified the whole, which is no longer the same. We can see these elements and themes in many of Tom's paintings, which are nevertheless unique creations. As an artist, Tom clearly felt the need to speak out on issues of the day. People that knew him well repeatedly speak of his sincerity and his sense of honesty. Sometimes he spoke to specific events, people, and places. Sometimes his work touched upon themes that were of a more universal, timeless, or aorist nature. His self-portrait here before the wall, that is the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. by Maya Lin, is a good example. The work is very minimalist, a wall with a long triangular form built from panels of dark granite with the names of the fallen arranged in columns that themselves have a slab-like shape. The letters were rendered mechanically, just like Tom's stencils, and they are readable. The smooth surface of the wall, punctured only by the names, draws the viewer in a way that helps the viewer to see himself or herself there together with those that can only be there in name. Tom stands in front of this wall taking a picture, but he is also turned toward you, the new viewer, to question why this all had to be. It is a painting in the style of René Magritte that questions what human condition could have wrought such trauma, and he plays the role of the individual that is caught up in it, even now. You may not see it at first, but Tom DeSalvo is an actor. His paintings each are a kind of play in which he is a presence and a protagonist. In the Candy Skin series, Tom plays the role of the artist-actor who follows a clear narrative, and this is what distinguishes his work from what we call pure performance art. You may not see it at first, but Tom DeSalvo is an actor. His paintings each are a kind of play in which he is a presence and a protagonist. In the Candy Skin series, Tom plays the role of the artist-actor who follows a clear narrative, and this is what distinguishes his work from what we call pure performance art. Here we look at Tom DeSalvo's painting Sloth, which is one of the 7 deadly sins and number 9 in the Candy Skin Chronicles series. The text reads, "Pigricious poor in spirit procure pearls of poetry and paint, buying dearly what is not for sale to dry-browed dons and donnas. Candy Skin, volatile as flame, dances by the trophies in the vaults." The painting includes representations of Peggy Guggenheim and Leo Castelli posing as sculptures on Michelangelo's Medici Chapel in Florence, as Candy Skin dances to the musical score of Fossils from Camille Saint-Saëns' Carnival of the Animals. It's easy to see the pun on the name of Vasily Kandinsky in Candy Skin, and it is clear from the texts that provide the background for the scenes in the paintings that Candy Skin uses the pronoun she, but it takes greater reflection to realize the extent to which Tom is role-playing. Don't let it be lost on you that the skin in Candy Skin is the skin that an actor dons for the performance. Tom gives to the character Candy Skin the role of a guide through what he considered to be the hypocrisy of the contemporary art world, focused more on money than on artistic statement or visual gravity. Though the explicit reference here in this painting is to the biblical Salome as blended syncretistically with the Hindu god Shiva, one might also see Candy Skin as a kind of guide through a Dante-like inferno. Tom DeSalvo ultimately takes his place among the ranks of Italian-American artists. Regina Soria's Bibliographic Dictionary of Italian-American Artists from 1776 to 1945, the year in which Tom DeSalvo was born, includes over 350 names, some of whose work is known on a national scale, like Constantine Bromidi, who painted the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C., to Joseph Stella, no relation to Frank, whose reinterpretation of Italian futurism and abstraction still rings contemporary, to others whose fame may be found in more regional settings. Her point was to document the ways that art is an essential element of Italian culture, not only in European Italy, which for centuries has been a magnet for artists in all media, but also in Italian communities elsewhere in the world, in what we now commonly call the diaspora. Soria writes, "All Italian-American artists have a tradition to fall back on. The interaction between the ingrained Italian artistic gifts and American opportunity has given and continues to give America many outstanding painters, sculptors, and craftsmen. In most cases, their work did not gain them recognition. They traced their origins from many parts of Italy, and in most cases, they went back to Italy to their source of inspiration. From early sculptors of the US Capitol to the decorators of churches in the 19th century, to the realists of the Depression era, the art of Italian-American artists and craftsmen, cabinet makers, and primitive painters offers an extraordinary view of America. Each of their stories is a unique one. Each presents the common thread of a lifelong love for art." Tom DeSalvo certainly fits this profile. He came from Sicily, and he did return there for inspiration, but he was active as an artist here in South Florida, and he has left a significant artistic legacy both in Italy and in the United States. He had a tradition to fall back on in Bagheria, a city that has produced cultural icons such as the painter Renato Guttuso, the filmmaker Giuseppe Tornatore, and many others. Though Tom spent considerable time in Sicily, it is not clear yet the degree to which, or even if, he actually engaged with other Sicilian artists. Tom did receive significant recognition through his 1992 show at Bagheria. The show was presented by Professor Antonio Buttitta, Dean of the Faculty of Letters at the University of Palermo and son of the important Sicilian writer Ignazio Buttitta, also from Bagheria. And I can tell you anecdotally that Tom is still a vivid presence in Bagheria today among the people that knew him. But Tom DeSalvo also differs from the ranks of many other Italian American and Sicilian artists in that, unlike the search for beauty that Soria places at the center of many of her artist biographies, Tom's art often does not seek to embellish and reassure. If anything, it denounces political, social, and economic injustice through irony and direct or accusation or sarcasm. Tom was an activist who both engaged in issues of the day and pondered those of a more universal nature. Everyone that knows someone has a particular image of that person, and it's unlikely that two people will ever know that someone in the same way. Memories of a person held dear by family, friends, or close associates reflect the way they wish that person to be. Differences in understanding become magnified when an artist becomes a public figure. Roland Barthes put into words the critic's need to engage with artwork directly by speaking of the so-called death of the author, which distinguishes the author's intent from the interaction that the critic, or here the viewer, has with the particular work of art. The viewer brings his or her own experience, we might call it baggage, into the interpretation, and for Barthes, this is okay, even necessary. The viewer sees what the viewer wants to see, what catches the viewer's attention. And that's the way that works of art take on a life of their own, through the engagement of the viewer. They immortalize the identity, the priorities and preoccupations of the artist through the things that the artist put in effort to produce. But they also outlast the mortality of their author, and with time, they take on a meaning of their own. In this spirit, I invite you to spend time with the paintings of Tom DeSalvo. There is no true substitute for seeing a work of art in person, but the virtual show that has been prepared for you on this website provides a tantalizing first look into the ideas, issues, visions, and the joy of art making that filled his spirit, and that is the heritage of all that encounter his work. Like all profound works of art, the more attention you give to them, the more you will discover. Happy viewing.